The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we're looking back at the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference held in Paris and trying to better understand what happened there and what the agreement means for the future. But first, let's get better acquainted with the climate science and models that prompted the Paris Climate Conference in the first place. Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell. I'm here with Piers Forster, Director of the Priestley International Centre for Climate and Professor of Physical Climate Change at the University of Leeds. His expertise is in quantifying the causes of climate change and how the climate responds. Hello, Piers.
Good afternoon, Desiree. Good afternoon, Tamsin.
And also joining us is Dr. Tamsin Edwards, a lecturer in environmental sciences at the Open University in the UK. Tamsin is active in talking about climate science with the public, tweeting as Flimsin and writing for Vice News, Guardian Online, and her PLOS blog, All Models Are Wrong. And she's regularly interviewed by the media about the knotty issues of climate science and modeling. Good to have you here, Tamsin.
Hi, good afternoon.
All right. So to give all of us some background for the episode, what do current models tell us about the possible future of climate change and how it might affect the planet?
Well, there are two aspects to climate predictions. There's what we do in terms of population, technology changes, energy use, and so on, and then what the climate does in response to that. And the way climate scientists typically think about this is in scenarios. So we have a kind of abstract way of thinking about the changes in energy use and so on, and then say, well, what will the climate do in response to that? And at the moment, we're using these very unfriendly named scenarios called RCP, Representative Concentration Pathways. And the sort of business as usual or business more than usual scenario is called RCP 8.5. And the model predictions for the global mean temperature change between the pre-industrial period and the end of the century, for that sort of top-end scenario, is kind of around the 3 to 5.5 degrees of warming. And for the kind of lowest of the four scenarios, called RCP 2.6, the models give about a 2 in 3 chance of staying below 2 degrees. So kind of a 1 to 2.5 degrees sort of range since pre-industrial. And those are just basically possible futures, what-if scenarios. They're not trying to say we know exactly what population and energy changes and so on will be and land use changes. They're just saying, if this happens, we think the climate will do this.
Well, now, how confident are we in the predictive quality of climate models?
Well, I do think we can be quite confident in terms of their ability to predict changes in surface temperature. So they are quite good. They do get the right sort of temperature change through time, and they do reproduce quite effectively the historical temperature changes going further back in time. So they are quite good when it comes to temperature, but when it comes to some other aspects of climate response, particularly like change in rainfall, they do really not do quite a good job. So we have quite a lot of difficulty predicting what parts of the world will see increases in rainfall and parts of the world where we see a decrease. But we are beginning to get some understanding of those changes. But we do still have some confidence in things like rainfall extreme. Like we can say with some degree of certainty that as the temperature goes up, we will see an increase in rainfall extremes. So there are some aspects of climate change we have good confidence in, and some aspects we do not.
And another example of that, if I can add one, is sea level rise. So we're confident that sea level is going to go up. The global average sea level is going to go up in the future. There's quite a lot of uncertainty on how much. Is it going to go up quite a lot or really a lot? And of course, the other uncertainty is how that changes around the world. So actually, in some places, the sea level rise might be small or might even go down because of changes actually in the ocean circulation patterns. And in other places, it will be a lot bigger than the global average. So you have a sort of, for sea level rise, it's an example where you have a lot of confidence in the direction of change, which is up, but less confidence in the details of that change.
So now I understand that our climate science models are getting better. So what does that mean, and how would we know that they're getting better?
It's a really subtle and interesting question, because we can test climate models with all of the data about weather and planetary change that we have. Some of it reaches back, not just decades, but centuries. Direct measurements with thermometers and all different aspects of weather, and more recently satellite data. And we can compare that with what climate models simulate in the past. If you take a climate model and start in the year 1850 and run it forward to today, you can say, given the greenhouse gas input and the changes in the sun and volcanoes and so on, what does it get the kind of temperature and other weather patterns that we know happened? But what's difficult is, you only have so much data. The climate is a very complex system, and climate is also a long-term phenomenon, several decades. So that kind of limits how many tests you can do. But certainly there's a lot of very thorough testing with the data that we do have of lots of different aspects of climate change, reaching quite far back in time. And also actually looking further back in time into the distant past, we can look at indirect sort of estimates of what past climate change was like, for example, in the last ice age. And so we can basically build up a sort of aggregate picture, and that picture has been improving over time.
That's absolutely correct. I think it's important to rephrase slightly what we're trying to ask, and we're really trying to ask if these simulations are really fit for purpose, because perhaps if we're just trying to predict the globally average surface temperature, they will do a very good job of predicting that temperature change, but there are some aspects they will not be so good at predicting. So it depends what we want to try and do with them. For example, if you're a town planner for a particular town in Canada, you might want to know precise details of the way your climate will change through time, and to really predict those changes are far more challenging, and we perhaps won't ever be able to predict perfectly.
Absolutely, and I think a nice, concise way of expressing that, I think is so important to us climate scientists and other modelers, is a phrase by a guy called George Box, a brilliant statistician who sadly died a couple of years ago, which I named my blog after. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So a model will never be perfect. It can never simulate every tiny process on the planet. We don't understand every process on the planet well enough to put into a model. And so we know that, it's not going to be a perfect representation of the planet, but we know its limits, and so we know what we can use it for. So even if climate models are getting better over time and getting better at reproducing the past, we always try to build in a tolerance of error, a kind of a conservatism, just trying to allow for the fact that we know they're not perfect, and we know that we may have not reproduced everything perfectly, that there may be surprises in the future that we haven't thought of. So in a way, we try not to reduce the uncertainty too much, but just enough.
Well, so now I'm wondering then, with all that being said, are we able to tell which countries or areas are going to see the most severe early effects of climate change, or maybe are already experiencing them?
Well, we can certainly tell where we do expect climate change first to emerge from its background variation, and these are in the tropical countries, because the typical tropical country normally does have quite an equitable climate without much variation from one year to the next particularly. So, in fact, for these countries, a relatively tiny change in the temperature, or in fact the temperature change we have witnessed since pre-industrial of around 1 degree centigrade, really does have a big effect on the climate of these countries, and it really does push them into something they haven't experienced before. And I think it's very unfortunate that it also typically, many of these tropical countries are also some of the most vulnerable ones to climate change as well. They don't necessarily have the preparedness or the infrastructure to really cope with it as well. So they're some of the most vulnerable countries. And they're also typically the ones that are not responsible for climate change. So they have it particularly unfair, if you like.
Yes, if I can just follow on, in terms of the biggest climate change, one important area, of course, for Canadian listeners is the Arctic, where the changes are going to be much bigger than the global average. And we're already seeing these big changes in the sea ice coverage, in the minimum sea ice in September, as we know. And it's against the background of large variability. So it's different from the tropics where you have small variability. But the biggest absolute changes are probably those of the Arctic. So to give a bit of context as well, in the global average, although we see, very different regional changes, the global average, I think, is a difficult number to get a feel for. If we're talking about 3, 4, 5 degrees of warming in the future under the highest of the 4 scenarios, or perhaps even more, that's about as much warming since the pre-industrial period as we saw cooling when we were in the height of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. So there were great ice sheets covering across, obviously, parts of North America and Northern Europe. It really looked like quite a different world. And that was only 3, 4, 5 degrees or so colder than today as a global average. But of course, regionally, some places were much colder. If you were close to or on top of these big ice sheets, then it was really a lot colder than it is, say, in Canada today. So I think, in a sense, it's useful to have that picture of the regional change being big somewhere like the Arctic. And, if you imagine something like 10 degrees of warming in the Arctic, that feels like a more substantial number than these 2 or 3 degrees in the global average. But just to give context for the global average, we're talking roughly the same amount of warming potentially this century as we've seen since the height of the last ice age to the pre-industrial period.
This is Science for the People, and I'm talking to Piers Forster and Tamsin Edwards about climate models. So a little later on in the show, we are going to speak to Yamide Dagnet and Richard Black about the politics and processes of the Paris Climate Agreement. But I do have a couple of questions on the more science side of that agreement. So can you explain this whole 2 Celsius limit? What is that referring to?
Well, in a sense, it's a slightly abstract target. It's a round number which is big enough to make a difference and small enough to be potentially achievable and to avoid the worst impact. So it's in a sense an ideal, an abstract target. It's been around for decades, this idea, since the 70s, of 2 degrees being a limit. It's only been put into policy, in more recent years than that. And it's really, even if it's an artificial threshold, it's been a useful way to encapsulate the kind of scale of changes. We can think about the warming up to 2 degrees as being broadly like we've already seen 1 degree of warming, and so it will be a bit more than that. And that seems like a sort of a useful threshold versus things like 3, 4, 5 degrees, which really do look slightly different.
Well, what I think about the 2 degree target is that I do think it has become a very useful shorthand, but I do think we have to be a bit careful about the shorthand because it isn't the 2 degrees we are concerned about particularly. We are concerned about some of the climate impacts associated with 2 degrees. So we ought to think more about the risks involved, I think. I do think the way that I'd like to think about it is that as the world's temperature goes up and up, and as it goes up by about 0.1 degrees, the risks go up commensurately with that. So we have a lot of evidence that do say a lot of the climate impact we experience to go up with the surface temperature. So therefore, for every 0.1 degree of increase in surface temperature, we expect the risk to go up, whether that be of forest fires, whether it be of torrential rainfall, or whether it be of sea level rise. But in fact, the sea level rise one is a bit different than the others, because that doesn't just go up with the temperature, that continues to go up and up and up once the temperature does stop going up. So we have to be particularly concerned about the sea level rise changes. So that is why the Paris Agreement did begin to talk about these 1.5 degree temperature targets, and that was really put into the agreement by the low-lying islands. Were really passionate about trying to push for the 1.5 degree temperature target.
Absolutely. I think the target really depends on what aspect of climate change and its impacts you care about, in a sense. So, for example, we're already seeing climate changes and impacts at 1 degree of warming that we've already had. There was a report recently about coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef, suffering sort of a quarter or a third of degradation, and a lot of uncertainty about how much recovery is possible, but potentially up to 2 degrees of warming has been predicted to potentially degrade up to 60% of coral reef. Arctic sea ice, if you exceed 2 degrees, it's been predicted that it will be nearly ice-free in the September minimum. And so if coral reefs or Arctic sea ice are the things that you are most concerned about, or if you live in, as we've had, low-lying islands, and worrying about sea level rise, you might be concerned about a lower target. It may be that if you are concerned about other things, that a different target is appropriate, and it really does depend on the aspect of climate change and its impacts you're thinking about.
So at this point, now there is a tangible difference between a 1.5 sea limit and a 2 sea limit. But is that enough? Are we in a situation where any improvement is valuable at this point, or is it more that if we don't achieve that 2 sea limit at very least, then we're somehow beyond the point of no return? Because that is how it's presented in sort of various camps.
Well, I think humans are not about to die out. We're in general, there are enough wealthy people in this world who can either adapt or then help others to adapt. We're obviously an inventive species, so we're not about to die out anytime soon. If that's what you mean by the point of no return.
Yes,
but
thank you.
The most important thing is to think about climate change in terms of risk. And there are 2 aspects to risk. There's the probability of a bad thing happening, so you can try to reduce climate change itself. And then there's the severity of the impacts. What is our vulnerability to climate change, or the vulnerability of different species than ours? What is our exposure to climate change, living by the sea, for example? And so it's not an on-off switch, good, bad, solve climate change or don't solve climate change.
Right.
It's really about reducing risk where you can.
I would absolutely agree with that. And I would also like to add that I think it becomes rather dangerous just to be fixated on trying to achieve a particular temperature target. Because if you really are fixated by getting the Earth down to a certain temperature, you could begin to conceive of some quite radical technology to try and get you there. And one thing that's being talked about in some communities is the idea of geoengineering or climate engineering, where in fact you deliberately try and make the Earth more reflective to sunlight. So you put mirrors in space or put particles up in the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight to cool the Earth temperature down by a purely technological solution. And I think some of the technologies are really quite frightening in terms of the side effects they could intervene with. So I do think being fixated on a temperature target is probably not a good idea. We ought to be more concerned with mitigating the risks of our impact.
Absolutely, and something like trying to increase the reflectivity of the Earth, of course, while it might tackle temperature, it can have different impacts on precipitation, which are difficult to predict. It can perhaps reduce rainfall around the world on average, but also it doesn't do anything to tackle the effects of CO2 dissolving in the world's oceans. And that has effects on the pH of the water, which affects things like, it contributes to the degradation of things like coral reefs and other life. So by focusing too much on a single number and a single aspect of climate change, you might end up ignoring other aspects that are just as important, if not more so.
Piers, Tamsin, you've actually made this far more understandable. Thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank you for your time.
And we've linked to our guests at scienceforthepeople.ca. And next up, we'll be speaking to two more guests about the contents of the Paris Climate Agreement and what it means for all of us. Stay tuned.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and we've been talking about the science behind the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm joined now by two guests who can tell us a bit more about the political side. With me is Yamide Dagnet, a senior associate with the World Resources Institute's Collective Climate Action Objective. She worked on the ACT 2015 project on the design of the Paris Agreement, and she's now leading the implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement at WRI. Also with me is Richard Black, a science and environment correspondent with BBC News for 10 years, and he's now the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, a think tank based in London, dedicated to improving understanding on climate and energy issues. Good to have you here, Yamide and Richard.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Indeed. Hello, everyone.
Now, just to give us some background, Paris wasn't the first time we tried to get together and come to an agreement on climate change, was it?
No, by no means. Paris was the 21st, by some counts, time that the convention of the UN Convention on Climate Change had met. The previous really big one, I think, that most people will be familiar with, was the Copenhagen Summit of 2009. That was the last time politicians attempted to agree a really massive global deal. Paris was very different. I mean, first of all, it was a success, and Copenhagen, by most accounts, was a failure. Why was it a success? I think there are a number of different reasons. First of all of the major countries clearly wanted a deal, which wasn't the case in Copenhagen. Secondly, climate impacts were becoming more visible around the world, which concentrated the minds of a lot of governments, and public opinion was clearly also in favour of a deal. Thirdly, you had the prices of renewable energy and so on clearly coming down in a dramatic way, which makes the clean energy transition that's necessary to prevent dangerous climate change seem more realistic. And then I think the fourth thing was that the conference was, and the processes behind it were managed really well, that the French did a fantastic job diplomatically. You had the US and China showing real leadership and making clear that they, as countries responsible for almost half the world's greenhouse gas emissions, really wanted a deal. So a very different situation and a very different outcome.
Definitely, I would add a few things. I think we need to remember also the Kyoto Protocol. It was one of the very first after the Convention on Climate Change was agreed in 1992. Countries met and agreed this Kyoto Protocol. The difference with Paris is that it was not universal. It was binding only developed countries, the OECD countries mainly, to take leadership and to take concrete action to curb their emissions. And that's really something to remember, because what we got with Paris is the realization that all countries are part of the solutions. And from the smallest islands to the biggest countries like the US and China, they're all in the game to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. In addition, and yes, I can talk a little bit more about what I believe can be perceived as factors of success compared to Copenhagen.
You mentioned all countries. So who did participate in the Paris climate talks?
It's not even all countries, it's all key actors. I think what we have seen in Copenhagen is that not all actors were mobilized. You didn't have the faith-based community or the Pope intervene, like we saw in the run-up to Paris. So I think the dimension of non-state actors is pretty amazing and should not be understated. So you had really the business, private sector, faith-based community, the civil society, of course, all the parliamentarians. We had also some summit with 400 parliamentarians from all over the world. The cities have have actually led ambition, since Copenhagen in a drastic way. So I think those actors, and I'm sure that I am missing a few, should really be acclaimed. I think what the presidencies, especially from the Peruvian till Paris, have done is really, with the support of Christiana Figueres and the UNFCCC Secretariat and Ban Ki-moon, have been to really mobilize and galvanize the groundswell of actions to demonstrate that things are really taking off from the ground. Obviously, I think in Paris, no country were excluded. All countries were there. I think, the only actors that I may think of that were not as involved, maybe because more skeptical, or the oil companies. But apart from that, it was a very universal mobilization. And it was amazing to see, and I think Richard said it before, the way the French managed the negotiations and the summit was pretty historical and quite amazing, because when you have to manage 196 different national interests, and to make sure that those who you have been portraying as disruptors of an agreement in the past become actors of this agreement was not easy to do, but it was really a game changer. And I will give you an example. In Copenhagen, you had Venezuela really opposing this deal because it was simply not ambitious enough. And the negotiator, was given portfolio to really get all countries to agree on the preamble, which, if you look at the preamble of the Paris Agreement, it's quite ambitious, with a societal, economical, environmental, and people dimension that has not been seen before. And I think empowering them to really act, to have everybody to play a role in getting an agreement that is as ambitious and people oriented and practical as possible was really a game changer. So yes, I would say that all, and even the oil companies, were welcome. It was really a summit for everyone.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on one thing that Yamide said, with which I completely agree. you had different communities across the world who were all pressing for a deal. So, for example, the parts of defence and security community, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly pressing for a deal. You had doctors in the medical community through the Lancet Commission pressing for a deal. Above all, you had the religious community. You know, the papal encyclical was an amazingly transformative thing. Every major faith basically urged making a deal. And it was very difficult then for those recalcitrant countries to go anywhere else. And there's one other thing which may seem very trivial, but actually is quite important. The French provided really good food, and people were going around with smiles on their faces, right? Which that may seem a trivial thing, but happy diplomats make deals and unhappy diplomats don't.
The logistics matters. I agree. It was better.
Well, what were the major points of disagreement? Because I understand there was a lot of agreement, which is lovely to see, but there was definitely major disagreement around some specific points, correct?
Yes, there was. And having been, actually, I was a member of a delegation during Paris with the LDCs, and differentiation was a major source of contention. As you know, it was everybody was working on an universal deal, but the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, this equity dimension was really at the heart of the debate. So how to bring everybody in, but still acknowledging different stages of development, different national circumstances, and the fact that developed countries, based on historical grounds, should still take the lead, and because also of their capability, should also, it was another reason for them to take the lead. So how to craft an agreement that acknowledge that, but still bring everybody in to have on a common journey that is as ambitious as possible. I think that was really one of the crux of the debate here, and that lasted until the final hours. And the two provisions where this was particularly felt, and the two provisions that was last agreed were transparency. So how to make sure that countries are doing what they said that they would be doing, and also the finance provisions. How to make sure that yes, we still have developed countries taking the lead, but providing opportunities to open the pool of contributors, and still making sure that developing countries in need get the support they need to fulfill with their requirements. At the same time, how to bring something that is aligned with a goal, a financial goals that actually shift the investment towards a low carbon and climate resilience society. The other issue, in addition to transparency and finance, was loss and damage. This is an issue that always been, it's not new. It's been brought especially by small islands and these developed countries from the beginning of the climate negotiations under the convention. But it really resurfaced in a big way in Warsaw. And then in Paris, we knew that what was at stake was how to deal with the compensation and liability issue. And that spiced up the negotiations also considerably, and it's good to see that the deal was made to address to balance some of the requirements from developed and developing countries in definitely seeing this issue having a proper space to be discussed and to be pushed and progress forward, and at the same time acknowledging some of the constraints from some political constraints from some developed countries, for them to be able to actually sign this deal, not to cross too many red lines, especially in the case of the US. So I think these three issues were probably the most contentious. And yes, I'm happy to go more into the details, but that's a kind of overview, I think, of what I felt the most contentious issues.
Yeah, if we were to do a Venn diagram, I'd also pick out three issues, and one of them would, I'd agree with Yamide as the top three, which was the loss and damage damage. And the issue is very simple, really, here. For people that don't follow this intricately, it's probably just worth putting on the table what this actually means. Emissions from developed countries, the ones that industrialized first, have caused a certain amount of damage, which is inescapable, which you cannot prevent now to some of the most vulnerable countries. So basically, should those rich countries pay for that in some way? And we're talking here about the US, the UK, and Germany as the countries with the sort of top three in terms of historical emissions. Bound to be contentious when you think about it. The other two issues that I think were quite contentious and sort of partially resolved. One was the issue of what the temperature destination should be, the temperature target. A lot of the smaller developing countries were very, very keen to have 1.5 Celsius rather than 2 Celsius as the new norm. And in the end, that's in the agreement as an aspiration. It's not a firm target. And there is a big mismatch here, really, in the whole Paris outcome, in the sense that you have these twin temperature targets, a target of well below 2 Celsius with an aspiration for 1.5 Celsius. But if you add together the commitments that individual countries have made in terms of reducing emissions, you can't get to either of those goals. And then the third issue I would pick out, which is in a sense the most profound, I think, is what's called the long-term goal. I mean, scientists and experts come up with all kinds of very, very detailed scenarios and projections for how you have to reduce uses of fossil fuels in the future in order to meet any goal that you pick out, 2 Celsius or 1.5 Celsius or whatever. But you can essentially boil that down to a single thing. You have to stop using fossil fuels. Right. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put this forward very, very clearly in their last report. But of course, for some of the states that their whole income relies on producing fossil fuels, this is a deeply contentious issue. And the Saudis and some of the other Gulf states were very, very reluctant to have a long-term goal in there. But it is in there. It's in a slightly fudged form. But essentially, if you boil this down, essentially we are talking about countries having agreed to eliminate fossil fuel use at some point in the second half of this century. And that's quite profound.
So how quickly will countries need to act to keep in step with the goals of the agreement?
I think there are two separate issues I'd like to bring out here. One is simply getting the Paris Agreement into action. So legally, it comes into force when 55 countries, accounting for at least 55% of global emissions, have ratified or whatever each one needs to do, because each country's political system is different. I think there's quite a need to get that done quite urgently, frankly, because there are a few quite important governments where you can see backsliding is possible. In the US context, for example, if it's not done under the Obama presidency, it probably won't be done under a Trump presidency.
That is
what about
terrifying statement, sir.
It's absolutely possible. I mean, that's why the Obama administration and John Kerry are absolutely determined that they are going to get it done before President Obama leaves office. But there are other countries that, you can't immediately see. Well, you can create scenarios where there are problems ahead. What about Russia, for example? All kinds of geopolitical issues. Could Russia sort of withhold ratification as a bargaining chip? Presumably it could. Even Europe's not that stable. If we have a sort of British exit, and you have an increased domination of those climate skeptic countries in Europe, such as Poland, in the debate, could you have the situation where the EU didn't ratify? I think it's unlikely, but I think you can construct that scenario if you wish. So that's one thing. More profoundly, in order to meet those temperature goals of well below 2 Celsius or 1.5 Celsius, you're basically talking about developed countries switching to low carbon electricity systems within the next kind of 15, 20 years, rolling out electricity into areas such as transport and heating within the next 20 or so years. And the same thing sort of happening in developing countries slightly later. For developing countries, really, the issue, I think, is leapfrogging. A lot of them don't have to go through the sort of fossil fuel era that Western countries have gone through. And indeed, you can see that in a lot of the plans that developing countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, whatever, put forward. Well, not so much Pakistan, actually. Certainly Bangladesh, India, and some of the Southeast Asian countries put forward. That leapfrogging is kind of implicit. One of the other things that the Paris Agreement does is to liberate $100 billion per year some of which will go towards helping those poorer countries to install clean energy systems.
Yes, I would just add, in terms of timing, I totally agree with Richard that developing countries have a bit more time to pace their transformation. But I would just flag that at the same time, the opportunity to leapfrog is now. I mean, decisions regarding the infrastructure of those countries are being made now in the next, between now and the next 10 to 15 years. So making sure that we don't wait that much, to make the right choices is absolutely necessary. And I think the narrative about the benefits and opportunity of actions, for a much better world, for well-being for the whole society is something that we need to be further entertained and maintained and actually even supported, more visualized. That's important. I think the urgency, I would just press for the urgency. Some of the action needed to be done yesterday and is becoming more costly not to act. I think what happens in Paris is the most vulnerable countries, which were a little bit left out of the Copenhagen deal, really came together strongly to say, hey, in 10 years, some of us may not have land to when we come back on the table and see how far we have been. And this is why also, in addition to the long-term goal, they have been pushing for a cycle of review and progression on in terms of ambition every 5 years. And I think that was pretty transformative as well. It's good to have those long-term goals, but at the same time, you need nearer-term policy signals also for the investment communities and policymakers. And I think what Paris has been doing is to do those. And I think the challenge for countries is to bring the urgency, and especially for developing countries, to align their long-term opportunities with their urgent needs. How to mainstream climate in their poverty and development strategies. I think this is, that nexus actually between the sustainable development and climate agenda is going to be really important. And we should not forget that last year was an incredible historical year because we also, ahead of Paris, agreed the sustainable development goals. And I think we need to bring that also in context. And sustainable development is not just for developing countries. It's actually, there's a few challenges also for developed countries. So how to make this happen and how to align those national plans that we see from all countries in there, what they call nationally determined contributions, with all those cooperative actions, initiatives that have been pledged in Paris, like Mission Innovation, the Solar Alliance, that brings so many countries and different state actors to really be integrated into the national policies. That's going to be the challenge moving forward, too.
Well, and that's exactly my question. You mentioned how. So that is my question, is how. What kind of strategies might we see coming out of this?
The Paris Agreement is pushing for long-term strategies, mid-century strategies. They're voluntary, but I think this is something that is quite important to try to get countries to see how they're really going to transform the economy in the long term. And Canada and the US have been pledging to do their own strategy by the end of the year. But some other countries have engaged into such kind of scenario exercise, like the UK with their 2050 calculator, the EU and many other countries, including China, to try to see what it means in the long term. And I think there's going to be different take of what those mid-century strategy means. It should not be seen just as a modeling exercise. It could be also a qualitative exercise, a political exercise, and how, again, the nexus with the sustainable development agenda is very important. At the same time, all countries need to start to implement what they committed to ahead of Paris. their nationally determined contribution. But some of them it's good to see that some of them already identified opportunities to review upwards, to review their ambition up, like, Argentina and maybe other countries to see whether they can, even by the time they register, their national contribution within the UNFCCC, to make sure that their national plan is even stronger. So I think, and we have this cycle every 5 years. And I think one of the challenges for countries to put in place the national mechanism to inform with good evidence, their policy designs and the policy implementation. What the UNFCCC, the multilateral world is bringing is a space to share experience and best practice, and to also avoid doing the same mistakes as, others, and to learn how to leapfrog, to learn definitely how not to do the same mistakes. So I think there's a huge opportunity to learn. It's going to be a learning journey, but one of boldness as well, and to align the short-termism with the long-term, the long-term aspirations, and the mainstreaming climate into the sustainable development agenda, and bringing all actors, integrating the groundswell of actions with all actors, how to make sure that actually some states and cities are doing so much. Are they really captured into the national inventories, or is it?
That's really one of my questions. Now, we keep using the word voluntary. So what does this mean? Can we talk about accountability? Because is there anything, penalties, fines, diplomatic sanctions, anything like that, Richard, that will force people? Nope. Okay.
Nope. Certainly no fines or sanctions. No, not at all. And this is one of the lessons from Copenhagen, is that if you try to do that, it ain't going to work. The implementation is largely going to be in the hands of national governments. Now, of course, there'll be naming and shaming, and one can envisage that there will be diplomatic pressure. A friendly nod here, and so on and so forth. The 100 billion per year that I mentioned earlier, which will probably go up in years to come. That's a sizable sum of money, and if developing countries want to get that, they're going to have to show, how the money's going to be spent, and so on and so forth. But Yamide referred earlier to infrastructure change, and I think that's the really big thing. Essentially, tackling climate change, if you want to boil it down to a single thing, is you build low carbon stuff rather than high carbon stuff. And I think that when countries are now contemplating what they're going to do that's new, the stereotypical example being, do we build a coal-fired power station, or do we build a giant number of giant solar farms and reckon we can get some storage and so on in a few years' time? The choice is increasingly to do the clean energy thing. And we're seeing that now, because the sums of money that are being invested, in clean electricity stuff around the world comfortably exceeds what's going into fossil fuel electricity stuff. So that's already a bit of a win. And we'll see the same thing. I think the same thing happen, for example, with electric cars and so on down the line. A much harder issue, particularly for developed countries, is getting rid of the high carbon stuff that we already have. Because when you have a city, I live in London, many dwellings in London are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. They're poorly insulated. You can't really do things that you would like to do, such as, for example, district heating schemes. It's just impossible. So it takes a lot of willpower for governments to tackle that kind of high carbon, old fashioned wasteful stuff that we have. So we're seeing, for example, just since Paris, China's had a clampdown. It's basically put a moratorium on building new coal-fired power stations in most of its provinces. Vietnam's reviewing its coal building plans. The incoming Philippines government is reviewing its coal building plans. These are all great things, and they're really important, and shows, I think, that Paris is potentially quite transformative. But in one sense, they're quite easy to do, because it's about building one type of new stuff instead of a different type of new stuff. And the big challenge, including for countries such as Canada that are established, is really, how do you get rid of that old high carbon stuff?
Well, and one of the things that we actually didn't mention that I have heard some concern about when we're talking about the Paris climate agreements is a lot of people thought that it really failed to adequately address vulnerable countries and their losses due to climate change. Any thoughts on that?
I think the devil is in the details, and it was important to really keep everybody's in. And Paris is about setting the vision and setting, the trajectory, giving guidance to, where we're going. Now it's really about how we make it happen. So all the details are going to be crafted in the next 2 to 4 years before this Paris Agreement enters into force. Truly, or before the first, COP under this agreement. It's very important to think that it's unfinished business in some sense, that there's really opportunities to make it better, stronger. On loss and damage, I would just add that, yes, the fact that there's a clause for vulnerable countries that there's not going to be liability or compensation, was a big deal maybe for them. But some of them felt that the most important outcome was to create that space, to actually do something concrete, to cooperate truly together with all the actors in this field to really help vulnerable countries to address those losses, when adaptations to adaptation, and to really to see how to address the loss and damages. So it's really, I think, the cooperative signals. I think there's been a task force on displacement has been set up. This is the first time that the issue of migrations and displacements had been really raised to such a political level. It was not the case before, and we will need to see how this task force that is being set up, what it's going to be doing. It's about, again, implementation. I think we created the seed. We've got the seeds here to do some things that never been done before, and I hope that all actors will embrace that to make it work effectively.
Is it safe to say that both of you are actually quite optimistic about the future of this process?
Well, speaking for myself, I am optimistic. It was never going to be solved at one summit, one agreement, and, one expects that, 10, 15, 20 years' time, there will still be bits of the picture that remain to be worked out, because this is we're talking about a fundamental transformation of the way that the global economy works. The end of fossil fuels, which is kind of where we're going, plus big sort of transformations in the sort of, adaptation and compensation space. Well, let's not say compensation, but loss and damage space. These are quite profound transformations. But yeah, I think the UN Climate Convention nearly died after Copenhagen, and it's now not only back on its feet, it's roaring like a newly restored lion, which is fantastic. Out in the real world, substantial things are starting to take place. I was mentioning China earlier on. If you look at China's sort of development plans for its energy system, it's not coal-fired power stations. It's not even gas. It's a clean energy system. And you pretty much know that China will deliver. You look around other countries in the world, Denmark, for example, 40% of its electricity from renewables. Norway, electric cars leading the market. There are all these indications around the world of substantial transformations. Look at some of the Pacific Islands, committed to 100% renewable energy. They're going to get there. The issue is timing. Science sets a timescale for the scaling down and elimination of fossil fuels if you want to reach 1.5 or below 2 Celsius. That you can't pin it down to an individual year, an individual trajectory. There's too much uncertainty in understanding precisely how the climate system responds. But it sets you a tight timescale. It's on a timescale of decades. And that, I think, is the big question, is whether this transformation can be made to happen on a timescale of really a few decades that enables you to keep the temperature change down and prevent some of the major damages. I mean, we know there are going to be damages, that's inescapable, but prevent some of the really sort of major, serious, irreversible damages out there.
Yes, and I am also optimistic as Richard. I agree 100% with what you've just said. I would just say that the good story about it is that the deniers cannot say that things are not happening on the ground. Even when you look at the American context, they cannot say that developing countries are not acting anymore, because everything that Richard has highlighted, things are already happening. It's not in the future. And what we've seen after Copenhagen, I would just, take this opportunity to really, say why Paris was a success also, and why I am so optimistic is, yes, you had this Cancun COP after Copenhagen that restored faith in the multilateral system. Then, in Warsaw, you had in Durban, you had these COPs that really try to bring everybody's in a universal agreement, to move from, two different worlds, bifurcated approach to one world, with still caveats and provisions on equity. And then you've got Doha that brought, this issue of, so dear to vulnerable countries like loss and damage into the fore. And you had, the Lima, the COP in Lima, that really, after the climate action, the climate march and summit brought up by Ban Ki-moon, this COP actually really formalized in this agenda the role of non-state actors and the groundswell of actions. And I think all of this was to demonstrate that things happen on the grounds, and there's no time to bicker about, who does not what. I think it's actually about not being left behind. The hope is that this agreement is really going to generate a race to the top, and for even some oil companies to think carefully how they can still remain the energy provider in the future, because some things are changing, some decisions are made, and they need to think about what is being now considered as stranded assets. They have to get their infrastructure, their investment resilient as well. So that other side of resilience, things are changing, and they cannot say that it's not the case anymore. So yeah, let's make it an empowering journey. It's really to make sure that in this journey it is equitable, that everybody's in, and people are not left behind. I just wanted to really take this opportunity to highlight how many things have been happening in the background, and it is very important and to pay tribute to the role of Christiana Figueres. I think she had a very challenging task, after Copenhagen, to really bring the whole negotiating process and multilateral process back on track, and to support the journey of negotiators and all policymakers and leaders in getting an agreement that is very ambitious, and to make it, I think her vision to really bring wider stakeholders was really unparalleled. And this was also with the support of Ban Ki-moon. I think he made climate a personal journey, and it's I take a bit of time to say this because, those people are going to continue on another journey, and it's very important for their successors to really continue to fulfill the ambitions that they have managed to really start to get on the ground. And I think just wanted to really pay tribute to this climate queen and climate king that really made the difference to the world.
Well, thanks very much to both of you for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And I'd also like to thank Jacqueline Gill at the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine for some brilliant additional research assistance this week. And you can find links to all of our guests on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People. Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Whitten. Coordination and additional behind-the-scenes support comes from the enthusiastic Skepcheck Network team. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. Science for the People is listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount. In return, we regularly post special patron-only extra content and after-show casual conversations with guests. This show is created in partnership with the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skeptic at skeptic.org. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders and me, Desiree Schell.